Gabe Carter stood on the rooftop of a half-finished skyscraper in New Chicago, staring up at the brilliant, star-filled expanse stretching above him. It looked the same as it always had, silent, vast, infinite. But it wasn't. Just beyond the atmosphere, hidden from the naked eye, a wall of warships loomed in orbit. A blockade is so absolute, so suffocating, that no ship, no signal, no supply line could escape or enter. Behind Gabe, the city was changing. The once bustling streets had gone eerily quiet. Supplies were dwindling. Trade had stopped. And every day, more people whispered the same question. How long before we starve? How long before we surrender? He clenched his jaw. Not happening. A gust of wind kicked up dust, and the distant hum of an emergency broadcast echoed between buildings. The same message the Zarnoth had been repeating since the blockade began. This is the will of the Zarnoth Empire. Compliance ensures survival. Resistance ensures suffering. Submit, and the suffering ends. Gabe smirked, a dangerous, reckless sort of grin stretching across his face. Hate to break it to you, boys, he muttered under his breath, but you picked the wrong species to bully. His comm device crackled. A woman's voice, sharp, exasperated, unmistakably cut through the static. Carter, if you're done brooding dramatically, you might want to come inside. I just figured out how to break the most sophisticated blockade in galactic history. Gabe exhaled a short laugh, his pulse kicking up. Alina Kovalenko, a genius physicist, his closest friend. If she said she had a way out of this mess, she wasn't bluffing. On my way, he said, turning toward the stairwell. He paused, glancing back up at the night sky one last time. The Zarnoth thought they had humanity trapped, thought they had finally bent Earth to its knees. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Gabe didn't know how yet. He didn't know when. But he knew one thing for certain. They were going to regret this. Gabe took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart pounding, not from exertion, but from something far more potent. A dangerous thing, but he'd take it over despair any day. The city hummed beneath him as he ducked through the half-finished corridors of the skyscraper, slipping past empty office spaces that would never be filled, and glass panels that would never be installed. The world was slowing down. If Alina didn't have an answer, there wouldn't be a world left to save. The underground lab was hidden beneath a gutted subway station, one of the many relics of Earth's pre-spacefaring days. Now, it was the beating heart of the resistance. He stepped inside, blinking against the sharp, artificial light, and found Alina exactly where he expected, hunched over a console, her white lab coat draped over the back of a chair she never actually sat in. Blonde hair tied up in a messy bun that suggested she hadn't slept in at least 48 hours. She didn't look up. You're late. You called me 90 seconds ago, he replied. And you're late, she deadpanned, eyes still locked on the swirling projections of data hovering above her workstation. I found the loophole. You're going to love this, or hate it, probably both. Gabe crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. I'm listening. Alina exhaled through her nose, something between exhaustion and exhilaration, and spun to face him. The Zarnoth blockade is absolute. No transmissions in or out. No ships leave the atmosphere. No foreign vessels land. But, she tapped a glowing line of code, her sharp blue eyes sparking with triumph. They screwed up. Their regulations are based on strict definitions of travel. And what is travel, Gabe? His brain worked quickly, scanning the possibilities. Movement through space, he said slowly. Exactly, Alina grinned. The blockade prevents anything from moving through traditional space. But it says nothing about movement through quantum tunneling. His breath caught as the pieces clicked into place. You're saying we don't need to go through the blockade? Alina pointed a finger at him. We just need to exist somewhere else. The weight of what she was saying sent a shiver down his spine. Quantum tunneling, an anomaly of physics. Something that shouldn't be possible yet undeniably was. Matter ceasing to be in one place and reappearing somewhere else without ever crossing the space in between. The Zarnoth thought they had locked Earth inside a steel cage, but they had designed that cage with a very specific lock, and Alina had just found the skeleton key. For the first time in weeks, something fierce burned in Gabe's chest. Tell me you can make this work. Oh, I can make it work, Alina said, her voice edged with excitement. The question is, how far are you willing to push it? Gabe tilted his head, something dangerous curling at the corners of his mouth. Alina, You're talking to a man who wants an entire space yacht through customs by classifying it as oversized luggage. She rolled her eyes. Yes, and I still lose sleep over that. But this? This is bigger. If we do this, we don't just get a ship past their blockade. We prove they don't own us. We show them that humans don't break. For a moment, the lab was silent except for the distant hum of machinery. Gabe looked at her, really looked at her, the exhaustion behind her bravado, the weight pressing on her shoulders. She had spent her entire life proving the impossible was possible. Now, she was asking him to take that possibility and turn it into something more, something unstoppable. His answer wasn't in doubt. He clapped his hands together. All right then, let's surprise off an empire. The Zarnoth blockade was a masterpiece of control, a seamless net of warship, surveillance drones, and automated sentries that tracked every molecule moving in and out of Earth's atmosphere. No transmission, no supply run, no escape. They had sealed the planet in a perfect, airtight grip. But perfection was brittle, and Alina had found the crack. Gabe didn't waste time. Within hours, he was deep in the underbelly of Earth's last free city, threading his way through the dimly lit tunnels of the old subway systems. The place had become a maze of hidden workshops, makeshift factories, and black market trade hubs, proof that even when choked, humanity adapted. Engineers, ex-military operatives, and outright worked side by side, driven by the same thing, defiance. He stepped into a repurposed train car, now a command center strung with cables and hollow screens. A handful of key players were already there, waiting, some leaning against the rusted metal walls, others sitting cross-legged on crates of stolen Zarnoth tech. All eyes turned to him as he entered, but it was the low, gravelly voice of Michael Ortez that cut through the tension first. "You're serious about this?" the man asked, arms folded, skeptical but intrigued. A former starship pilot turned underground operator, Ortez had seen his fair share of desperate plans. Gabe grinned. "Wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Alina stepped forward, throwing a projection into the air, a three-dimensional map of Earth, surrounded by a dense lattice of Zarnoth ships. But this time, a single pathway pulsed in red, weaving through the blockade like a ghost. "This," she said, "is where we make our move." The murmurs started instantly. "That's a challenge," Alina said. "They'll vaporize us before we get anywhere near the edge." Ortez narrowed his eyes. "What makes you think this works?" Alina's gaze sharpened. "Because we're not moving through space. We're existing in two places at once." She zoomed in on the simulation. "Their blockade is perfect at detecting physical movement, but quantum displacement isn't movement in the way they define it. We won't be flying through their sensors, we'll be blinking past them." Gabe leaned against the nearest crate, watching their faces shift. The idea was insane, but not impossible. And if there was one thing humans thrived on, it was turning impossible into Tuesday. A younger, barely past 20, shook his head. "Okay, sure. Let's say we can ghost past their blockade. What happens when we actually get out? Their fleets are waiting for anyone confident enough to try. You think they'll just let us waltz away?" That was the trick, wasn't it? Getting out was only half the battle. Staying free was the real problem. Alina exchanged a look with Gabe. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I was hoping to save this part of the plan until after we succeeded. But," he gestured to Alina, who sighed and pulled up another holo display. This time, the projection was chaos. Across the galaxy, thousands of tiny, seemingly insignificant bureaucratic requests, complaints, and trade permits had been flooding Zarnoth systems for weeks. "I call it the paperwork tsunami," he said smugly. "Turns out, when you make a government that relies entirely on regulations and oversight, there's a lot of very specific loopholes you can exploit. See, every single one of these requests requires review. They need an official signature, a cross-jurisdictional verification, and in at least 3 cases, a handwritten response from their high council." He clapped his hands. "And wouldn't you know it? A couple thousand of these just happened to be classified as urgent." The room was silent for 3 full seconds before Ortez let out a low, incredulous laugh. "You're weaponizing bureaucracy?" Gabe shrugged. "Hey, they're the ones who built a system so complicated it collapses under its own weight. I'm just helping speed up the process." Alina flicked the holo display off. "Long story short, they'll be so buried in red tape trying to approve, deny, or investigate these requests that their fleets will be functionally paralyzed for at least 72 hours. Gabe pushed off the crate, pacing the room now. 72 hours is more than enough time for us to prove this works. And once we do, once we start running rings around their blockade, this stops being an escape mission. This becomes a trade route. Then, the younger, the one who had doubted them before, leaned forward. "You're not just trying to escape," Gabe said. Gabe met his eyes. "No, I'm trying to break the blockade entirely." A slow grin spread across Ortez's face. "Now that's something I can get behind." One by one, the others nodded. By the time the Zarnoth realized what was happening, it would already be too late. The moment the first ship vanished, the war room aboard the Zarnoth flagship erupted into chaos. Alarms blared, red emergency lights pulsing like frantic heartbeats. Officers scrambled over each other, mandibles clicking in confusion, their sleek control panels flashing urgent warnings in a language older than Earth itself. Admiral Varric Toth, a towering figure of armored scales and cold efficiency, watched in stunned silence as the holographic battlefield shifted before him. A human ship had just disappeared, not warped out of range, just ceased to exist. "Scan again," he ordered, voice low, dangerous. His officers obeyed, frantic claws flying over controls, but the readings remained the same. The vessel was gone. And then, barely a breath later, it reappeared. But not where it had been. It was now outside the blockade. The Admiral's pupils constricted to slits. Impossible. Nothing could pass through the blockade. The containment field was absolute. His mandibles twitched. A new notification scrolled across the main display. Thousands of bureaucratic inquiries had flooded the fleet's administrative system. Each one marked urgent, high priority, requires immediate review. Varric's claws curled into fists. Paperwork. These humans were using paper as a weapon. On the ground, in the depths of the old subway tunnels, Gabe Carter clenched the edge of his chair, heart hammering as the live data streamed in. It was working. The Zarnoth hadn't moved. They couldn't move. They grounded their ships in a mire. Meanwhile, Alina's quantum tunneling algorithm was picking apart their so-called impenetrable blockade. It had taken months to get here, weeks of planning, days of execution. And now, in a matter of minutes, everything hung in the balance. "Next wave is ready," Alina said beside him, fingers dancing over her tablet, sweat glistening at her temple. "Are we going?" Gabe exhaled sharply. Every instinct screamed at him that this was too easy, that something was wrong. Then the war room doors burst open. Michael Ortez stormed in, eyes wild. "We've got a problem." Gabe's stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" Ortez slammed a datapad onto the table, its screen flashing with a single transmission intercepted from the Zarnoth fleet. "Countermeasures deployed. Initiate planetary purge protocol." For the first time since this insane plan had started, the room went silent. Alina's voice came out strangled. They're going to act on the planet." Gabe's breath hitched. No more blockade. No more red tape. Just act. Outside, the first beam of Zarnoth plasma artillery split the sky, its crimson glow turning night into a hellish dawn. The siege of Earth had begun. From the rooftop of the underground command center, Gabe Carter watched as Zarnoth plasma cannons carved streaks of fire across the heavens. The blockade had failed, and now the Empire was doing what all did when they lost control. Below, the city was in chaos. People scrambled for shelter. Buildings groaned as shockwaves from orbital strikes rippled through steel and concrete. The streets that had once pulsed with defiance now echoed with sirens, screams, and the dull, thunderous hum of warships moving into formation. Gabe's pulse pounded in his ears, but his mind was ice cold, cutting through the panic. The Zarnoth had played their final card. If this was going to be humanity's last stand, then fine, but they weren't going down on their knees. Alina's voice crackled in his earpiece. "We still have one shot." Gabe sprinted down the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. Lungs burning, he didn't need to ask what she meant. He already knew. The quantum displacement array. It had been a fail-safe, a theoretical last resort. Alina had spent the last few months designing it in secret, unsure if it would ever be used. Not a weapon, not a shield, a ripcord, a way to flip the rules of physics against the Zarnoth the way they'd done with the blockade. And now, It was their only chance. He burst into the lab to find Alina at the control panel, fingers flying over the interface. The screen glowed with a single, untested equation. If it worked, the blockade wouldn't just be bypassed. The entire war fleet would be displaced into deep space, sent so far beyond known civilization that it would take centuries to return. If it fails, well, then none of this would matter anyway. Alina's hands were shaking. She wasn't built for this kind of moment. The adrenaline, the pressure, the weight of 8 billion lives balancing on a few lines of code. Gabe stepped up beside her, steadying her hands with his own. "We've come this far," he murmured. "We finish it." She swallowed hard, then nodded. The final key press felt like the quietest sound in the world. A pulse rippled outward, invisible to the naked eye but tearing through reality like a tidal wave. Every Zarnoth warship flickered, convulsed, then simply ceased to exist. The silence was deafening. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, the emergency broadcasts began flickering back online. Dazed, breathless voices filled the channels, pilots reporting clear skies, civilians sobbing in disbelief, military officers barking confused orders that no longer mattered. The fight was over. Gabe let out a breath that tasted, then turned to Alina. She looked exhausted, like she'd just given birth to an impossible miracle. He pulled her into a fierce hug, and for once, she didn't pull away. Above them, the first sunrise in a free sky began to break through the fading smoke. Humanity had just proved that there was no force in the galaxy, no empire, no blockade, no war machine that could ever truly break them.